I drove back from Memphis on a Wednesday afternoon in March with a laptop bag on the passenger seat and the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from hard work but from 3 days of meetings that could have been emails. 41 years in commercial construction will do that to you. You learn, eventually, that most of what gets said in a conference room is just the sound of people reassuring themselves that they are necessary. I had stopped needing that reassurance sometime around my 53rd birthday. My name is Martin Calloway. I am 63 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I built Calloway Bridger Construction from a two-man operation in a rented office on Nolensville Pike into a regional firm that at its peak was managing 14 active projects across 4 states and employing more than 90 people. I did not build it alone. My partner, Roy Bridger, built it with me for the first 16 years before he retired to a house on Lake Barkley and a fishing schedule that I genuinely envied. After Roy left, I bought his share and continued. That was 7 years ago. The company had my name on the door and my fingerprints on everything inside it. I turned off I-40 onto the exit toward Brentwood, where we had lived for the past 18 years, and I noticed the way the afternoon light was hitting the hills, the way it does in early March when the trees are still bare and the sky is that specific shade of pale gray that is not quite overcast and not quite clear. I noticed it because I was the kind of man who noticed things. I had always been the kind of man who noticed things. My former colleagues would tell you that was my best quality as a builder. You cannot manage a construction project emotionally. You manage it by reading what is actually in front of you and responding to what the data says, not what you hoped it would say. I pulled into the driveway of the house on West Haven Circle at 4:47 in the afternoon. Sandra's car was not there. This was not unusual. Sandra taught private piano lessons 3 afternoons a week, out of a studio she rented near Green Hills, and Wednesday was one of those days. What was unusual was that the front door was unlocked. Sandra never left the front door unlocked when she was not home. She was meticulous about it in the way that people who grew up without much security become meticulous about the small securities available to them. I had always understood that about her, and I had always respected it without ever saying so directly. I pushed the door open and I stepped inside. The living room was empty. Not empty in the sense of no one being present, empty in the sense that the furniture was gone. The couch, the armchairs, the coffee table Sandra had found at an estate sale in Franklin 3 years ago, and refinished herself over 2 weekends in the garage. All of it was gone. The bookshelves that had lined the east wall were gone, though the small indentations their feet had pressed into the carpet over 18 years remained. The photographs were gone from the mantelpiece. The framed print above the fireplace that Sandra had carried back from a trip to Savannah in 2015 was gone, and the nail it had hung from was still in the wall. I walked through the room without thinking. The way you move when your mind has not yet accepted what your eyes are seeing. Through the dining room, where the table and the 6 chairs and the sideboard were gone. Down the hallway, where the console table and the lamp had been removed and only the small circular shadow of the lamp's base remained on the floor. To the kitchen, where the dishes were gone and the pots and pans were gone and the cabinet doors had been left open so that the emptiness inside them was visible. The way you leave a window open after something has died in a room and you want to let the air through. There was something on the kitchen counter, a single white envelope, my name on the front in Sandra's handwriting. The clean, precise cursive she used for anything she considered important. She had always written my name the same way, the capital M slightly larger than it needed to be, the letters even and deliberate. I had watched her write it on birthday cards and holiday cards and notes she left on the counter when she went somewhere and expected to be back before I noticed she was gone. I stood at the counter for a long time before I picked it up. I am not a man who moves on incomplete information. I had spent 4 decades in an industry where the gap between what a project looked like on paper and what it actually was could mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy, between a building that stood and one that did not. You learn in construction to read the site before you read the plan, to look at what is actually there before you decide what to do next. What was actually there was this. Sandra's car was gone. Sandra's furniture was gone. Sandra's things were gone. The front door had been unlocked, not because Sandra had been careless, but because Sandra had left it that way for me. Because Sandra had known I was coming home today and had wanted me to be able to get inside, which meant the unlocked door was not an oversight. It was a courtesy, the kind of courtesy you extend to someone when you have already decided they are no longer the person you are living with, but you have not yet stopped feeling responsible for their basic comfort. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. The letter was 3 pages, written on the heavy cream stationery Sandra kept in the small desk in the study. The desk that was also, I noted distantly, no longer in the study when I glanced through the doorway. She was a careful writer. She had always been a careful writer, the kind of person who chose words the way I chose subcontractors, deliberately, based on demonstrated reliability, with no room for ambiguity. The letter said she had been unhappy for a long time and had tried to find her way back to something she could not name, and had finally concluded that what she needed was not available inside this marriage. It said she had met someone who saw her in ways she had not been seen. It said the financial matters would be handled through attorneys. It said she was sorry. It said she hoped I would be all right. Behind the letter, paper clipped to the back of the final page as though it had been included as an afterthought rather than a deliberate act, was a single document. A real estate transaction record. A lease agreement, executed 11 days earlier, for an apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. The tenant named on the lease was Sandra Ann Calloway. The co-signer was a man named Philip Garrett. I set the letter and the document on the empty kitchen counter. I stood in the kitchen of the house I had owned for 18 years and I thought about Philip Garrett. I thought about how long it takes to become someone's co-signer. I thought about how long it takes to find an apartment, negotiate a lease, sign paperwork, arrange a moving company, pack a household, and coordinate a departure time to occur while your husband is 3 states away attending meetings he had told you about 6 weeks in advance. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about what I had known for the past 16 months. Because here is the thing that Sandra did not know, that she could not have known unless I had told her, and that I had been very careful not to tell her. I had seen this coming before she had finished planning it, and I had not been idle in the time between. Let me go back to the beginning, specifically to a Tuesday evening in November of 2 years prior, when Sandra came home from what she said was a dinner with colleagues from the music school where she occasionally taught master classes, and she was different in a way I could not immediately name. Not happier exactly, quieter, settled in a particular internal way, like a person who has just made a decision they had been struggling with and feels the relief of having made it, regardless of what the decision was. I noticed. I did not react. I had been noticing things for a long time by then, because the things that had been changing were not subtle once you understood what you were watching. The phone had started going to bed with her 8 months earlier, tucked under her pillow instead of on the nightstand where it had lived for the 15 years prior. She had begun driving herself to events she had always wanted company at before. She had started a new gym membership at a location across town rather than the one 2 miles from the house, and she went every Tuesday and Thursday morning with a consistency she had never brought to any previous exercise routine. I am not a suspicious man by nature, but I am an observant one, and what I was observing did not require a suspicious nature to interpret. It required only honesty. The name came later. In February, 11 months before she left, I was reviewing our shared calendar on the household iPad, the one we used for scheduling household appointments, deliveries, service calls, and I saw an entry she had made and then partially deleted. Partially, meaning the event title was gone but the time block remained. A Saturday afternoon marked only with a set of initials, P.G. I noted the initials and I did not alter the calendar. Philip Garrett. It took me 4 evenings and a willingness to be thorough to find him. 58 years old, former session musician, currently operating a small recording studio in East Nashville. Sandra had been a classically trained pianist who spent her 20s doing session work before she transitioned into teaching. Their professional worlds had overlapped for years, I found, in the specific way that Nashville's music industry overlaps. Shared credits on albums, mutual colleagues, the same rooms at different times. The photograph I found from a musician's benefit concert in 2019 showed them standing together with the particular ease of people who had known each other for a long time and were glad to have found each other. Again, I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything. I sat with what it meant and what it cost and what I was actually going to do, because those are 3 different questions and they require different kinds of answers. The answer to the third question was that I was going to protect what I had built. Not out of anger. Anger is a terrible advisor in a construction project, and it is equally useless in a financial one. But out of the same logic that had governed every significant decision of my professional life, you identify the risk ahead of time, you document your position, and you build your defenses before the storm arrives rather than after it has already taken the roof. I called a family law attorney named Catherine Howell, whose name I had gotten from Roy Bridger, who had used her in his own divorce 8 years earlier, and described her as someone who understood that preparation was not aggression. She had an office in Green Hills. I called on a Monday and she saw me the following Thursday. Catherine Howell was 60 years old, precise and unhurried, and she told me the truth without softening it. Tennessee was an equitable distribution state. In a divorce proceeding, the court would divide marital assets in a manner it deemed equitable, which did not mean equal, but which meant that Calloway Bridger Construction, as an asset whose primary growth had occurred during the marriage, was potentially subject to a marital property claim. The house, which we had purchased jointly, was clearly marital property. The investment accounts we maintained together were marital property. What was mine individually was what I could document as mine individually, and the documentation, she said, needed to be built carefully and completely before any filing occurred. She said, "Martin, I want to ask you something directly. Do you have reason to believe your wife is preparing to leave on a specific timeline?" I said I believed the timeline was somewhere between 6 and 18 months. She said, "Then we have time to do this correctly." We spent the next 4 months working with my accountant, a man named Earl Dupree, who had handled the books at Calloway Bridger for 11 years, and who brought to the task of financial documentation the same patient, methodical quality that had made him invaluable to me in the business context. Earl and I identified the premarital investment, the capital I had contributed before Sandra and I married, the portions of the company's growth attributable to documented factors independent of the marital partnership. We built a record. Catherine called it the most thorough asset documentation she had reviewed in a business of this type in recent memory. In the meantime, I was watching. In August, Sandra asked me about the business valuation. She framed it as idle curiosity, a conversation about what we might do if we ever decided to sell, a hypothetical. But the questions had the particular specificity of someone who had been thinking about them for longer than the conversation suggested. She asked about comparable sales in the regional construction sector. She asked whether I had had a formal valuation done recently. She asked what a fair market assessment might look like. I answered honestly, because I had no reason to reveal that I understood what the questions were actually for. I noted them, and I called Catherine the following morning. Catherine said, "She is establishing her understanding of the asset value. That's consistent with someone in consultation with a divorce attorney." She paused. "Martin, the joint investment account, the one with the combined balance. Are you aware that either account holder can initiate a transfer without the other's consent?" I said I was aware. She said, "I am not advising you to take unilateral action, but I am advising you to be aware that in situations where one party is planning a departure, access to joint accounts is something they sometimes use before a filing is made, because after a filing is made, those assets are under the court's supervision. I did not move the joint funds. I did not want to do anything that could be characterized as improper. But I did open a separate individual account at a bank I had never used jointly with Sandra, and I began directing a portion of my ownership distributions from Calloway Bridger into that account over the following months. Catherine confirmed this was legal, documented, and appropriate. By the time I walked into the empty house on a Wednesday afternoon in March, that individual account held $74,000 that I had directed there with a complete paper trail. The joint investment account, the one Sandra had been watching, held $280,000. The lease document on my kitchen counter told me she had already secured her destination. What it did not tell me was that Catherine Howell had already prepared the motion she would file within the hour of my phone call. I called her from the empty kitchen at 5:22 in the afternoon. She answered before the second ring finished. I said, "Catherine, she's gone. The house is empty. There's a lease for an apartment in Scottsdale co-signed by Philip Garrett dated 11 days ago." She said, "Are you at the house right now?" I said yes. She said, "Photograph every room. Photograph the lease document. Photograph every open cabinet and every empty space. Do it now while nothing has been moved, while the condition of the house is exactly as you found it. Can you do that in the next 30 minutes? I said I was already doing it. She said, "Good. I'm filing a motion tonight that establishes the marital waste framework and flags the Scottsdale address. Martin, I want to tell you something. The 16 months of work we have done, the asset documentation, the business valuation record, the earnings redirection with its complete paper trail, all of it is ready. We are not scrambling. We prepared for this exact moment. You are not behind." I said, "I know." She said, How are you holding up? I said, I'm reading the site. I'll process the rest later. She said that was enough. She said she would call me in the morning with the filing confirmation. I spent the next hour moving through every room with my phone. The bare walls, the nail holes, the bedroom where my side of the closet was untouched and her side was empty down to the last hanger. She had packed incrementally. I understood that now, looking at the closet. She had moved things out gradually, over weeks, a little at a time, the way water finds its level through a slow leak rather than a burst. You do not notice a slow leak until the damage is already done. I had noticed, but I had also had enough time to repair what I could repair before the water reached the floor. My son, Daniel, was 31 and lived in Knoxville, where he worked in project management for a civil engineering firm. He had his grandfather's steadiness and my habit of watching a situation carefully before he spoke about it. When I called him, he let me finish before he said anything. Then he said, "Dad, how long did you know?" I said, "I've been working with Catherine since last spring." He said, "Did you know about Garrett?" I said, "Since February." A silence. Then he said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "There was nothing useful to say until I had something useful to do. I needed to be ready before the situation was ready, not after." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm functional. That's what's available tonight." He said, "I'm coming over." I said Knoxville was 3 hours away. He said, "I'll be there by 9. Don't eat whatever's left in the refrigerator by yourself." He drove 3 hours on a Wednesday night and arrived at 9:14 with a bag from a barbecue place near the highway and 2 bottles of water and the calm, quiet presence of a person who understood that what you do when someone needs you is show up without making it about the showing up. We sat on the floor of the empty living room. There was nowhere else to sit, and we ate pulled pork from styrofoam containers and talked until the empty house stopped feeling like a crime scene and started feeling like a house that needed furniture, which is a different kind of problem. A solvable one, he said, standing up at some point past midnight to look at the bare walls. "She took a lot of stuff, Dad." I said, "She took the stuff that was hers to take. The rest of it is replaceable." He said, "What does Catherine say about the money?" I said, "The motion's already filed. The Scottsdale address is flagged. The lease document is evidence of pre-planned departure, which is relevant to how a court reads the marital waste question." He looked at me the way he had looked at me when he was 12 years old, and trying to decide whether to trust what I was telling him. He said, "And the business?" I said, "The business is documented. Earl and Catherine built a record that tells the story of exactly what I built, and when, and how. Whatever claim gets made against it is going to run into 16 months of preparation." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You're in project mode." I said, "It's what I know how to do." He said, "I know. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying you're also allowed to be the guy who came home to an empty house." I said, "I'll be that guy when the project phase is done." He said, "Okay." Then he said, "You know, Grandpa used to say you were the most prepared person he ever met." He said it like it was the best thing he could think of. I said, "Your grandfather understood what preparation actually is." My father, Ray Calloway, had filed for bankruptcy in 1987, when I was 24 years old, because a business partner had moved money without his knowledge during a period when my father trusted the partnership more than he verified it. It had taken him 11 years to rebuild what he lost. I had watched that process from the time I was a young man starting out in construction, and I had taken one lesson from it that had governed every significant financial decision of my adult life. Trust is not a substitute for documentation. The two things are not in conflict. You can trust a person and still maintain the record. In fact, the record is what lets you trust, because the record means you are never dependent solely on the trust. My father did not teach me to be suspicious. He taught me to be prepared. There is a significant difference. One is a posture of fear. The other is a posture of responsibility. The divorce proceedings took 9 months. Catherine Howell is exactly what Roy Bridger described her as: thorough, precise, and entirely unwilling to let the record be anything other than complete. The documentation we had built became the foundation of everything. The business valuation record, the premarital investment analysis, the earnings redirection, with its unbroken paper trail. 3. The lease document that established Sandra's departure as premeditated rather than impulsive. Sandra had retained an attorney in Nashville, a competent man named Whitfield, who had walked into a situation that our 16 months of preparation had significantly narrowed. The lease was the central issue. It had been executed 11 days before the divorce was filed. Philip Garrett's name on it, told a story about the planning period. The trip Sandra had made to Scottsdale, which I had documented through credit card records and calendar entries, corroborated the timeline. What the court ultimately found was that the manner of departure and the pre-filing financial arrangements constituted a pattern of dissipation of marital resources. The settlement was not everything I wanted. Settlements never are. But it was grounded in an accurate record. And an accurate record, in a legal proceeding, is the only kind of foundation that holds. There was one moment during a deposition in Catherine's conference room, 7 months into the proceedings, that I have thought about since. Whitfield asked me why I had opened an individual account and begun redirecting earnings 14 months before the divorce was filed. I said I had observed behaviors that led me to believe a departure was being planned, and I had taken legal steps to document and protect my individual earnings from that point forward. He said, "And what specifically led you to that belief?" I described what I had observed: the change in phone habits, the gym membership across town, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the initials on the calendar, the name I had researched in February. He said, "You identified Philip Garrett's name from a partial calendar entry?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And you researched him?" I said, "Yes." He said, "No further questions on that point." Sandra was at the deposition. She had been seated across the conference table from me for the first time since I had come home to the empty house. I had not looked at her directly since we sat down. After Whitfield said no further questions, I looked at her. She was looking at the table in front of her, not at me, at the table. In that moment, I understood something I had not fully understood before. Not intellectually, but in the particular way you understand something when you see it, rather than reason it. She had believed she was the one who had done the planning. She had organized her departure with the care and the patience and the long-range thinking of someone who believed they were operating on information their partner did not have. What she had not known was that the planning had been bilateral all along, that while she had been building the life she was moving toward, I had been building the record that would determine what she could take when she got there. The house on West Haven Circle sold in the fall. We divided the equity. I bought a smaller place in Germantown, a 1950s brick house with a deep front porch and a detached garage that the previous owner had used as a woodworking shop. The tools he left behind were not particularly good, but the bones of the space were exactly right, and I have spent the months since then making it into something I would actually want to work in. Daniel comes down from Knoxville once a month. Roy Bridger came over on a Saturday in October and helped me hang the new pegboard in the garage, which is the kind of thing a man who built something with you for 16 years does without being asked, when he understands that you need the company more than you need the assistance, but you will accept the assistance more readily than the company. I knew this about Roy before he arrived, and I said nothing, and we hung the pegboard and drank coffee and talked about the industry and the lake house, and a few things that had nothing to do with either. There is something I have not told you yet, and I am telling you now because it is the part of this that explains why I am the way I am in difficulty. My first wife, Karen, Daniel's mother, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease when she was 46, and Daniel was 11 years old. She managed it with a courage that I have never been able to describe accurately to anyone who did not see it. She died 9 years later at 55, after a long final year that I stayed present for in every way I knew how to be present. What you learn, when you watch someone face something they did not choose and cannot outrun, is the specific weight of the things you cannot control. And what you do with that weight, if you are paying attention, is use it to make you more serious about the things you can. I cannot control what a person decides in their heart. I cannot control when a marriage ends, or why. I cannot control the fact that I drove home from Memphis on a Wednesday in March and walked into an empty house and found an envelope on a kitchen counter. Those things happened and they cost what they cost, and the cost was real. What I could control was the record, the documentation, the 16 months of methodical, patient, entirely legal preparation that ensured that when the moment came, I was not standing in the rubble with no recourse and no foundation. I had the foundation. I had built it while she was building her exit, and when the two buildings were finished, one of them was built on documentation and one of them was built on the assumption that I would not be paying attention. My father used to say that the difference between a man who loses everything and a man who loses only what he can afford to lose is not luck, it is not strength. It is whether he was paying attention before it mattered, rather than after. I was paying attention. The garage in Germantown is coming together. The pegboard is up. The workbench I have been designing on paper for a month is now framed and waiting on the hardware. It is the kind of project that has no deadline and no client and no budget pressure, which means it is mine entirely, which is a kind of thing I had not had enough of and am now choosing deliberately. On Sunday mornings I go out there before the neighborhood is fully awake, and I work in the particular silence of early March, and I think about what comes next. There is always a next thing. That is the one thing construction teaches you that applies to everything else. No project is the last project. You finish the one you are on, you learn what it taught you, and you build the next one better because of what you know now that you did not know before. The workbench will be finished by spring. Good dimensions, good materials, built to be used for a long time by someone who intends to be here using it. That is what you do after. You build something that lasts. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. And if you are not already here, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.